Hello students, welcome back. We're going to start with this famous quote that actually highlights the importance of pawns in the game of chess. When we are beginners, we don't really appreciate how important pawns are. We just know they're 1 point and we don't really mind if we lose some of them or not. But as you get stronger and more experienced, you're going to start to understand how pawns dictate the whole game, and understanding the different pawn structures could determine who wins or loses the game. So we're going to start with this position, and feel free to pause the video and evaluate it, analyze it. And all I'm going to tell you for now is that it's the white pieces to move, and there's a very clever way to win this game. We're not going to go over it right now, we're going to leave it for the end, because first I wanted to go back to the basics. We're going to go over what a pass pawn is, different ways that you could create a pass pawn, how you could force a win once you have it, and then we're going to make our way up to more difficult exercises such as this one. So we're going to see this one at the end. Let me start from the very beginning. Here, as you can see, is just an endgame where we have the kings and pawns, and we have actually the same amount of pawns, but since the black pieces have a pass pawn, they will be able to win the game. Now, what is a pass pawn? Well, a pass pawn is a pawn like this one over here, like the H pawn. It is a pawn that could be pushed all the way to the end to promote without being captured by one of your opponent's pawns. So if I push this pawn up now, if I just go H5, this pawn can never get me. There's no other white pawn to block me or to capture me. So that's why we call this a passed pawn. Now, it's very important that you understand that it has to do with pawns only. Even if the white pieces had a rook, a queen, a bishop, all of these pieces over here, this pawn is still considered a passed pawn. So it only has to do with your opponent's pawns being able to stop or capture your own pawn. And the idea is that one of the most important things about passed pawns is that they require other pieces to control them and prevent them from promoting. Typically, that's the job of one of my opponent's pawns, but since my pawn is passed, they actually have to use other pieces. Like in this case, this king has to come over and prevent that pawn from promoting. So now you know what a passed pawn is, and if you look at the other pawns on the board right now, you're going to find out that none of them are pass pawns. If you look at this one, well, he's not a pass pawn because if I just pushed him, not only can he be blocked by this pawn, but even this pawn at some point could take him. If we look at this other pawn, same thing. This pawn, same thing. There's always someone to block them or take him. This pawn, same thing. If I just push, he's going to be captured at some point by this pawn on F2. And the same thing for all of the white pawns. All of them have someone to take them or capture them. This is the only pass pawn. And in this case, if you remember the rule of the square, this pawn could be easily pushed because the white king can never get in the square and capture the pawn. So I'm going to push, and I win this game because I have a pass pawn that cannot be captured. So now I get my queen, and all I'm going to do is use my queen to capture his pawns, and then we know how to win this game. Now that you know what a pass pawn is, guys, we have to talk about an even more powerful pawn, which is a protected pass pawn. So this is a pawn that is not only passed, he is protected by one of his friends, by another pawn. And as you can see in this position, this pawn is not only a big problem for the black pieces, but they cannot even get rid of him. Even if the king is so close, he cannot take the pawn. And we say that whenever you have these pass protected pawns, we say that they protect each other. Like this pawn protects this pawn because of course we cannot take or we'll be in check. And this pawn also protects this pawn because let's say I just move here and the black king goes to take this pawn. Well, we say he's being protected by the f6 pawn because now the f6 pawn can push and become a queen. The king actually got out of the box. So this is the box of the pawn. When the king moves here, he's out of the box and I can go. So basically, this pawn is also preventing the king from going after the pawn protecting the pass pawn. Now that you learned about the protected pass pawn as well, you're going to see how you could use this to win the game. Well, it's very easy. Basically, we already talked about how the king has to stay close to this pawn, so our king is free to go and capture the other pawn. So I'm just going to go here, and the king cannot go over. Like if he went to prevent me, well, he needs to be careful because now he's out of the box. If instead, let's say the black pieces, when I moved here, let's say they want to create their own pass pawn and they just push 2 steps. Now we have en passant. So we could easily capture and we have our own pass pawn. So these pawns are fixed and my king is going to be getting there quickly and I'm going to capture the pawn. This king cannot do much. My king goes over, attacking this pawn. And by the way, we call this a base pawn. So this is a pawn chain two pawns were connected. I have a pawn chain myself here, and the pawn protecting the other one is going to be the base pawn. So that's the weak pawn that we have to go after. The king cannot actually defend him. We know why. So they have no choice but to allow me to take it, and then I get another passed pawn. You see, now that this pawn has no one to stop him or take him, he becomes a passed pawn as well. So all I need to do is get out of the way and push him all the way to get a queen. So there we go. And now we know how to win this game. All right, so now we have this position where it's not only a king and pawns endgame, we actually have minor pieces as well. And I'm showing you this position because sometimes we don't have a passed pawn, but we have ways to affect the different pawn chains. Like in this case, I'm the white pieces, and I realize that if I take this knight, they lose the knight for free unless they take my bishop back. But when this pawn takes, then he's going to allow my a pawn to become a passed pawn. So he was here before, but I forced him to go to the c file, and now I have a passed pawn myself. I hope that from now on when you play your games and you're about to trade pieces, that you think about how the pawn structure is going to be changed. And this is one of the biggest changes you're going to see in your game when you start paying more attention to pawns. Every exchange could actually change the game drastically. So that's why it's so important that we pay attention to this and we actually understand it. So I'm going to leave this one here. We already know we just push the pawn, the king is out of the box, and we should be fine. Well, here we have another position before we get to the final one, and as you can see, we also don't have a passed pawn, but we, as the black pieces, have an extra pawn. We have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So on the king side, we have the same amount of pawns. However, on the queen side, we have 2 versus 1, and we call this a pawn majority, meaning that you have more pawns than your opponent. And all we have to do is find a way to trade one of these pawns for the pawn that they have here, and then we're going to end up with a passed pawn. So the way we're going to play this, and by the way, this is an endgame, and you should know by now, anytime you get to an endgame, the king becomes one of the most important pieces. So the king needs to be active, and he needs to come to help. At the beginning, in the opening, the middle game, the king is hidden because there's so many pieces that could get him in trouble. When we get to the endgame, there are not many pieces to get him in trouble, so he comes over to attack and help. So right now, this king is headed for this pawn. So the white king is coming to help and prevent me. So this is opposition, and my king cannot make any more progress. But now that the king is active, we're going to start pushing our pawn majority. And I want to take a break here and just go back. And just to show you guys, if I was to just push the pawns, and it might work sometimes, but if I just start pushing those pawns and this king gets active and mine stays behind, notice how the white king is going to be able to just help. So I take, if they take back, well, I take, and there's no passed pawn anymore. Even if they try to go, I think I might be able to get it before he promotes. So I'm just showing you this variation for you to understand the importance of activating the king first. So I'm gonna go back, we activate the king, and now we push. Even if they go a3, we cannot do b4 right now, but we bring another pawn. So that's the point. Now let's say they just push here. Well, time to create the passed pawn. So they take, we take back, and that's it. We have an extra pawn which cannot be blocked or taken by one of our opponent's pawns. And this should be enough to win the game. Let's say they go here, and now I could just get here and wait for him to just move and then I make progress. Or to make it even faster, I could just block his pawns on the other side. So remember, I'm not concerned about the king side because it's 3 versus 3. So they're not going to create a passed pawns like I did on the queen side. If I push this pawn, let's say they go, I don't know, here. I don't know, I could just go f6. If they go g4, I want to do g6. Always easier to just make sure you have one pawn facing the other pawn. So if he takes, I take back. Now this one blocks this one blocks this one. If he pushes, that's it. That's the end of the king side pawns. They have no more moves. They have to move the king. And now there's a very easy plan here to win. We could use this pawn as a bait. So what we're going to do is we're going to let him go. And this king cannot come and help these pawns because my pawn promotes. So the best thing he could do is go capture the passed pawn. But by the time he takes the bait, whose king is closer to the other pawns? Well, my king is. So by the time he gets here, I could do two things. Either I take the other pawn and I have two passed pawns, or I just push this pawn. I just need one pawn to get to the end. You see? Then here I need the help of the king and I promote. So guys, I hope these exercises actually show you how important pass pawns are, but now we're going to go to the last one. Here we are. This is the exercise we started with. In this position, like I said before, is a white pieces to move, and there's a very creative way to win. So this is an exercise that is not only going to help you work on your creativity, it's going to show the importance of the pass pawn. So the black pieces have an extra pawn, but that pawn, even though it's a pass pawn, my king is doing a good job blocking it, so he's not going to go anywhere. On the other side, even though I have the same amount of pawns for both sides, my pawns are way closer to the end than my opponent's pawn. So I'm going to be able to get one of them to the end and promote. And of course, it's going to involve a sacrifice. So I'm going to sacrifice some of my pawns just to get one to the end. Once my pawn becomes a queen, he's going to take care of everything else. And this is a trick that is good for you to know it, because maybe you get the opportunity to do it and win the game. But also, it's good that you understand it, because you might fall for this trick. So if you're the person, like in this case the black pieces with the extra pawn, you have to make sure that you don't let them get like this to you, because they could do this trick that you're about to see. And basically this is what you do. You go pawn g6, so the pawn in the middle, and now they have to take with this pawn, or else I'm going to take one of them and I promote. Now if they take with this pawn, now you have this excellent move, f6, and this is basically a deflection. We've already talked about deflection in this course. So now either they take me or I take them and I promote, and when I take, I deflected the defender of h6, so now I could just go on and promote. And it doesn't matter how fast they go, I'm going to promote way faster. That's it. Now my queen could come over and get that pawn. Now, I'm gonna go back. Let's say that when I do this move again, they take with this pawn. Well, I do the deflection on this side. He's the defender of f6. When he takes, I just go, and that's the end. I'm going to promote way before he can get to the end. And then the same, check, and I get that pawn. And then I get the rest of the pawns, and so on. I hope, guys, that you really understand what a pass pawn is and how important they could become. There are many other pawn structures we have to go over, and we're going to do that one step at a time. Go over this video as many times as you need. Leave me any questions you might have in the comments, and I'll be more than happy to go over it in the next video. With that said, I'll see you next time.